Afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. It's a challenging time of year, and we did only have a limited invitation, so you're in very exclusive company here today, and it's good to see you. And because it's a small group, we're running this as a very interactive session, so you can chat, ask questions as you go through. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're bringing the webinar today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this area. And we want to pay our respects to the elders of the Kulin Nation, but also the other traditional countries represented today. Our program is pretty simple. We're actually responding to a series of questions and feedback we've had from Global Covenant signatories and Cities Race to Zero signatories. So it's a fairly targeted webinar. I'll give just a little bit of background, then we'll jump into the information. So you'd be aware that ICLEI Oceania is the regional secretariat of the Global Covenant of Mayors for the Oceania region. So that's Pacific Islands, New Zealand and Australia. We've got about 50 signatories in the Global Covenant now. We've actually been picking up some Fiji and Solomon Island towns in the last few weeks, which is terrific, giving us a bit more of a geographic spread. There's also somewhere between 25 and 30 towns or cities which signed up to the Race to Zero last year, and you'd be aware that that was a special initiative launched by the UK government when they were chairing COP26 in Glasgow last year, and it really gave cities the opportunity to take on more ambitious targets and actions, sign up to climate emergency declaration, etc. So we've got some councils attending today who will be both Global Covenant and Race to Zero, some who are just Global Covenant and some who are just Race to Zero. And so the idea is that we're going to really give you a refresh today on reporting system, give you a chance to iron out some of the bugs and the uncertainties. Well, I'll do it properly. So we're going to have Sandy Morris and Hannah Paik from CDP, who run the reporting platform, speaking to us first. Then we've got Lex Lynch, who I think all of you would know from Ironbark Sustainability, again, giving you an update on the snapshot tool for greenhouse inventories, because that's really progressing well now. And then Dustin's going to speak to you about the new pillar that's just being introduced for the Global Covenant, the third pillar, which is all about access to energy and affordable energy. So that'll be three pillars: the traditional mitigation, adaptation, and now the energy access pillar. We'll allow time at the end of each speaker for you to ask some questions, but also there should be a bit of time right at the end for a general Q&A. So I think you've all met Dustin, but Dustin Cutler runs the help desk here at ICLEI Oceania, and so I'll hand over to Dustin now to run the first part of the program. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Steve, for that introduction. Yeah, I guess not to belabor the introductions, but I guess first off, we have Sandy and Hannah. They both are coming to us from CDP, and they essentially manage the Asia Pacific region. And they've just really been a huge resource for us, and the people that we go to and consult for, technical assistance on the CDP ICLEI reporting track. So yep, we just welcome them today. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Dustin. So I will share some slides from my side. I will assume you can see them unless you say otherwise.
That's good.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you so much for having us today. Yeah, we're really excited to be here and to have this kind of more intimate session where we can talk through all fun things related to reporting, but also help answer any questions you may have, and just have maybe a bit more of a discussion as well. We really want to also hear any thoughts that you might have in relation to the reporting based on your experiences from this year, or maybe any questions you have as you prepare for next year as well. Just to introduce myself, I'm Hannah. I lead our cities, states and regions work for CDP for the Asia Pacific region. And I'm actually joining you from Hong Kong, where both Sandy and myself are based. I do see some familiar names, but I assume not everyone will know CDP very well. So I'll just do a quick introduction to us as an organization. So we are a not-for-profit that started in 2000, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. And we run a global disclosure platform. So in 2022, we had almost 20,000 companies, cities, states, and regions disclosing through the platform. We also work with a multitude of non-state actors that also include investors, for example, who are looking at this data, as well as policymakers and so on. Just to say that this year we saw over 1,000 cities disclosed through CDP, and then over 100 states and regions as well. To dive into the reporting itself, the platform has been set up in a way that enables cities to report to a multiple number of initiatives and campaigns and so on. So as mentioned, Global Covenant of Mayors, also known as GCoM, Race to Zero, Race to Resilience, and so on. But there's also a number of others, such as cities who are part of the C40 network, the WWF One Planet City Challenge, which runs every other year. So there's the main ones kind of listed here. So what this means is that cities can basically report through one system, CDP-ICLEI track, and meet the requirements and also track progress and so on against all these different initiatives. So hopefully this has created more of a streamlined process for local governments. And then something to mention for 2022 is that we also have fully aligned the reporting to the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures, TCFD recommendations, because we're seeing that there's also an increase in cities who want to kind of incorporate those into their annual reporting as well. So just to touch upon GCoM specifically, the progress of GCoM, cities is recognized through what we call badges, each representing a specific category or pillar. So you can see here mitigation, adaptation, and then as mentioned briefly, the third one that will be introduced next year is access to energy. Just to quickly say, I think you'll probably know this already, but mitigation, refers to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, while adaptation refers to building resilience and preparing for the unavoidable impacts of climate change. And they're broken down into kind of three main steps here. It's mainly the inventory assessment, target goal, and then ensuring that there's an actual plan in place. So yeah, each of these badges is further divided into these steps and then shown as kind of progress bars. So this is just an example image. So if you've kind of met all the requirements, it will all kind of light up as you see in this image. If we move on to the next one, so this is just an example from one of the cities, Unley City Council. Each GCoM committed city will actually have a profile on the GCoM website. So you can go onto the GCoM website and basically filter by region, by or search specific cities as well. And so what you see here for Unley is on the left-hand side, you'll see, when they actually committed to GCoM, it says here 2020, the region. So this is Oceania, and then there's some details around population, the mayor's name, and so on. And then on the right is where you see that badging. So as your city progresses through the requirements, that these will be updated on an ongoing basis. So for example, for this year, we've just wrapped up the reporting last week, and we're in the process of doing kind of final validations and assessments for this year's reporting so that any cities that have achieved additional badges will see this updated for them. So the process in terms of the steps looks something like this. We've tried to break it down and make it as simple as possible. So the very first step is that cities make that commitment to GCoM, and this is actually similar to other initiatives, for example, Race to Zero and Race to Resilience. For GCoM, it requires a political kind of commitment from the mayor, so there is a letter that needs to be submitted. After commitment, then in order to track progress, and this might be just doing an initial kind of baseline reporting, cities are asked to report information on their climate action planning, including things like their inventories, their emissions inventories, vulnerability and risk assessments, as well as their climate actions. And we strongly recommend that the reporting happens on an annual basis, although some of the requirements may not be annual. So there's kind of different timelines that are required for the different components. But we do encourage annual reporting. The reported data is then validated against the requirements of GCoM, which is known as the Common Reporting Framework, or CRF. And then any gaps will be highlighted, and we provide feedback directly to the cities. So this actually is a bit of an iterative process. There's a number of kind of deadlines throughout the year through which you can submit data and then get feedback. So if you submit early, you can potentially get multiple rounds of feedback so that you can, make any improvements. Sometimes there might just be kind of minor mistakes that we'll pick up just to make sure that you kind of achieve the highest level of badging you can for that year. We'll then send the final data to the GCoM Global Secretariat, and cities will receive official communication, usually from the regional secretariat. In this case, it would be ICLEI, awarding those badges. So those will be coming, for example, for this year, if there are any cities that submitted recently, those will be coming relatively soon. And then these will then also be displayed, as mentioned, on the online profile on GCoM's website. And then the data actually also gets used towards a kind of annual aggregation report, which usually is kind of launched around COP. So kind of towards the end of the year. And then cities can always reach out to CDP or partners, throughout this whole process. So we often, get a lot of questions about the kind of technical sides of reporting, but also, when they need support and assistance for additional resources, to actually help support the actions that they're taking and so on. And GCoM from the Global Secretariat has progressively been building out their library of resources. So, if you haven't already, we would definitely encourage you to just have a look, because there's now a lot of materials and content and so on listed on their website as well. This is just a quick overview of the structure of reporting. So the kind of high level areas are governance, assessment, targets, planning, and actions. And then within each one, there's a focus on both climate mitigation as well as adaptation, and then some sector specific data. So for example, if we look at the assessment section, we are asking you to provide information on your city level risk and vulnerability assessments, as well as your greenhouse gas emissions inventories, and then some specific information related to things like transport sector, waste, and so on. And then when you move into the target section, then we'll be asking for information on your adaptation goals, your emissions reduction targets, and so on. So that's just a kind of quick overview of the actual topics that we're covering in the reporting. And then just to mention, this year there was a bit of an update to the reporting structure. So it looked a little different last year and in previous years, but this updated kind of structure will be what it will look like for 2023. So the benefit of that is that actually any data that's already been submitted will automatically copy forward for next year. So that will kind of reduce the effort as well for reporting. You might not have many updates from year to year, so you can keep those as is and just focus on the areas where you might have some updated data. I just wanted to mention quickly as well that CDP does also provide feedback through what we call CDP scoring. So there is a deadline kind of earlier in the year, which this year was the end of July. And then once you submit by that deadline, we can provide some feedback and gap analyses and so on against the reporting. We do recognize that cities are at kind of all different stages in their climate action journey. So this is, how we kind of acknowledge that through these scoring bands, disclosure, awareness, management, leadership. The leadership level is the only kind of scoring band where we will publicize the scores, whereas the scoring bands below that, all the feedback and scores and so on are private to your city. And then we just wanted to quickly kind of give a shout out to the cities that made it to the A list for 2022 for this region, which are listed here: Canberra, Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Yarra, Tweedshire, and Wellington in New Zealand. So, this is a huge achievement to be able to get to that level. We kind of try and raise the bar every year to really, drive and accelerate climate action, which is, ultimately what we're working towards. So just wanted to say a big congratulations as well to these cities. So I think at this point, I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague Sandy to talk specifically about science-based targets for cities.
Cool, thanks so much, Hannah. So hi everyone, I'm Sandy. It's nice to see you all. For those of you who don't know me, I'm also based in Hong Kong with Hannah, working for CDP Cities, focusing on the Asia Pacific region. I am a Kiwi originally, so always nice to be speaking to this region. So nice to see you all. If we can go to the next slide, I'll be speaking about science-based targets, including what they are, why and how to set them. So we'll start off with what they are. To be specific, by science-based targets, we mean a measurable and actionable target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Science-based targets must be robust and comprehensive, meaning they cover at least city-wide Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, also known as direct and indirect emissions. Science-based targets have to be, of course, science-based, meaning they are led by the latest climate science and in line with a 1.5-degree pathway. They also have to take in account equity, which means they represent a fair share of global emissions reduction. And so this takes into account the fact that local governments often have different responsibilities for emissions and then different capacities to act. It means that cities will therefore need to take different pathways to reduce emissions, depending on their historical emissions or current socioeconomic development level, depending on the different methodology that is being used. And then finally, cities shouldn't just be thinking about their long-term ambition to achieve net zero, but we also say that cities must set a midterm target to achieve by 2030 or sooner to make sure they're staying on track for their long-term ambition to reach net zero. So we can go to the next slide. So not only are science-based targets important to be, avoiding the worst impacts of climate change, but there are several benefits to do so as a local government. So one of those being it is a requirement of joining the city's race to zero. So as mentioned by Steve at the beginning, this is a global campaign, quite high profile and a good way for cities to sort of get recognition for what they're doing at the global level, but also to kind of set that ambition for your communities and get that sort of local buy-in and engagement potentially. It helps to define the level of action needed, which helps cities to plan concrete actions in line with that required ambition. And helps local governments to quantify their progress against these sort of well-defined targets. And finally, setting an ambitious 1.5-degree aligned midterm target will make it easier to reach that long-term net zero target and stay on track. So next slide, please. So one more reason that science-based targets are important if you are interested or motivated by CDP scoring is that science-based targets are what we call one of the essential criteria to be on the CDP A list. So essentially what that means, what that meant this year, being the first year we introduced this criteria, was that cities had to report one of either the long-term net zero target by 2050 or a midterm target by 2030, which is aligned with that fair share of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And so this was the initial sort of essential criteria for this year. Obviously, we want cities to be setting not just one of these targets, but both of these targets, both of these targets being science-based. So by next year, by 2023, it's very likely that we will make it a requirement to have both this midterm and long-term target to be eligible to be on the A list for CDP scoring. So yeah, to help you set a science-based target, we would recommend as a starting point looking at this guide for cities, which was released in 2020 by CDP-ICLEI and several other partners that you can see here. And this guide provides a bit of an introduction to science-based targets and information on these 3 existing methodologies, which can be used to set a science-based target. These methodologies have been evaluated by the Science-Based Targets Network against the principles of science-based targets that I mentioned a bit earlier, as well as their usability, so making sure they're easy to actually use and apply for cities. There will be opportunities to evaluate and include other methodologies in this list during some of the ongoing development work. So for example, we are aware of Ironbark's methodology of science-derived targets. So there is some scope in the ongoing work to evaluate these kind of additional methodologies for inclusion. But at the moment, these are the 3 currently approved and accepted methodologies that can be used. And the one that CDP recommends most frequently is the WWF One Planet City Challenge, so the 3rd one on that list there. And that's because it's one of the most straightforward to apply and most accessible in terms of the data that is required to calculate the target. And lastly, just to say, cities that are currently disclosing are able to receive free technical support on setting a target. So yeah, just get in touch if that's something you might be interested in doing. Cool. So I'll just briefly go through an example of one of the methodologies for setting a science-based target, just to give you an idea of how this would look in practice. So I'll go through the most simple one, which is the WWF One Planet City Challenge methodology. And this is the method for setting your midterm target for 2030, because the long-term target is just to set a net zero target by 2050. So yeah, it doesn't require any calculation. So yeah, it's relatively straightforward. Step 1 is to calculate the 2018 baseline per capita emissions. So that just involves calculating your scope 1 and 2 citywide emissions for 2018 and dividing that by your population in 2018. Step 2 is then to work out the what we call fair share percentage reduction target. So this is done by using your Human Development Index of the country to calculate a weighted 50% reduction target by 2030. So what that means in practice is that if you're in a country such as Australia or New Zealand with a relatively high Human Development Index, your target for 2030 would be higher than 50% reduction, whereas less developed or cities in less developed countries would have a lower than 50% reduction requirement according to this methodology. So you can see the exact calculation of how that weighting is done, or correction factor to calculate an adjusted 50% reduction target by 2030. Then steps 3 and 4 are essentially just to translate that percentage reduction target into your 2030 per capita emissions by multiplying the target by your baseline emissions value. And then lastly, to convert that per capita emissions value into an absolute emissions value by multiplying that by your projected population for 2030. So yeah, it's a relatively simple methodology, so something you could apply probably straight away. But yeah, like I mentioned, if you do want any support with that, we're very happy to help you go through that process for your city itself. And if you do already have a target that you've set and you want to just check whether it's aligned with this methodology, that would also be quite a straightforward process. So essentially you would calculate your 2030 target emissions based on the target that you've set already, and then just compare that to the result you get from following the 4 steps in the slide, and just see whether or not that is aligned with the result that you get. Cool. And so just to let you know a little bit about the future work of science-based targets for cities, the next phase of work will be looking at, so the Science-Based Target Network will be working with a university from Norway to develop a sort of full validation criteria for science-based climate targets. So the work so far has been kind of an initial check. The full validation criteria will look more in depth at the sort of coverage of the targets, things like offsets, and the sort of more detail you would be required to check for a full validation process. So that work is currently ongoing. And as I mentioned earlier, this work will also have scope to review other methodologies for potential inclusion or to be evaluated as one of the approved methodologies. So that's a bit of ongoing work that's happening at the moment and expected to finish by 2023, so the end of next year. And the outputs of this process will include a full validation criteria framework and additional guidance to cities on setting targets. So yeah, last but not least, yeah, we know that obviously setting a target is just one of the first steps, and so it's important that cities move quickly to implementing actions to achieve the targets and then tracking their progress. So in terms of tracking progress, we just wanted to finally touch on the reporting timelines for next year. So yeah, the platform generally opens in April. We have the scoring deadline towards the end of July, which is the deadline to receive a CDP score. We also have some later deadlines for GCoM and other initiatives all the way until the end of the year. But the main deadline that we encourage cities to submit by is the end of July. Ahead of that deadline, we also offer something called a response check, which is something that CDP offers to check cities' responses before they submit, before the final deadline, and just check for any gaps and give some feedback. And so that will be offered ahead of the scoring deadline. And just to mention that these dates are all tentative for next year, and we'll be touching base early next year with the confirmed dates. Yeah, so I guess lastly, just to say, we're very happy to kind of offer any introductory calls if any of you want to sort of learn more about the process. If you're new to reporting, or if you just have questions or want to have a bit of a refresher, you can just get in touch with us to book an introductory call. Also, if you did report this year and received your 2022 score, we are offering free score feedback calls for anyone who received a score from now until February 2023. So also please get in touch to book one of those in. That's kind of a chance for you to get feedback on your response and help you benchmark and plan for the upcoming year. So I'd encourage you to sort of take advantage of that if you would like to do so. And yeah, I think that's all from our side. So we're happy to take any questions, but I'll pass back to Dustin and Steve for the moderation. Thank you.
Great. Wow, thanks. Great presentation. Very informative. Thank you, Hannah and Sandy. Yeah, so if there are any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself there. And or if you want to raise your hand, we'll just give a second here if anybody wants to ask any questions. Yeah, I think, you know, from an ICLEI sort of perspective and, you know, linking what CDP does with the city's rest of zero, I think that was like one question that we found in sort of talking with a lot of the signatories and pledgees is the overlap between GCoM and cities rest of zero and where the science-based targets go is, you know, if they're meeting those science-based targets, or if they're reporting to GCoM, if they're satisfying that step for the city's rest to zero. Would you be able to comment on that, Hannah or Sandy?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this one. So the in terms of science-based targets specifically, that is relatively kind of newer compared to, for example, the GCoM Common Reporting Framework, which was developed before the science-based targets methodologies and guide were developed. So it doesn't, the GCoM requirements doesn't explicitly require science-based targets to be set by cities at this point, and we're not envisioning that change for next year. But there is something mentioned in the Common Reporting Framework about cities setting targets that are either as ambitious or more ambitious than their nationally determined contributions, so the national level targets. So that's kind of the main check that's done against the GCoM requirements, but it does not specifically require SBTs, at least against what the methodology that Sandy had just mentioned. For the Cities Race to Zero, that's slightly different. So that's also a newer campaign, and there is a mention of cities needing to set science-based targets. But just to say, because it was introduced more recently, there was like a bit of a grace period at the beginning for cities to actually, get familiarized and start making the commitments. So even with the reporting, it wasn't a kind of requirement at the outset. But starting from next year, I think this will, we'll be looking at this more and more in terms of the actual cities that have committed to the campaign, and then whether they've started their reporting and whether that includes science-based targets. And then the final thing to mention, which Sandy talked about briefly, was the CDP scoring. So that as well, is looking at whether cities have set a science-based target. And from next year, it will probably be more, we kind of said for this year, partially aligned science-based targets still meet the requirement of being able to achieve kind of that leadership level score, whereas next year we might be trying to kind of raise the bar, just because we know that on a global scale this is incredibly urgent, and more and more we're seeing more and more countries setting their net zero targets, and we know that it's required and needed in order to stay within the limits of global warming, temperature rises and so on.
Great, yeah. Well, thanks for that. Yeah, so if there aren't any other questions, just pass it over to Alexi. So Alexi, you guys many of you are probably familiar with Alexi. He's the business manager of Ironbark Sustainability. He has over 20 years of experience in sustainability and climate change. So yeah, we just welcome him today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Dustin. Can you guys see the correct presentation there and hear me clearly? Awesome.
Yep, looks good.
Thank you, and thanks, Sandy and Hannah, to get those updates. Yeah, it could be a very interesting year or two, I think, where we've got a good chance of seeing a big increase in reporting for councils as we look to try and find ways to make it easier, because I think there's going to be some emerging reasons why it'll be quite valuable to have the ability for councils to push the federal government to make sure that their NDCs are as strong as can be and bring the local government contribution to the table, which is something that's a bit hard to do in Australia at the moment unless there's an easy way to report. So I'm going to just give a bit of a background to Snapshot. I think I'll start by just acknowledging that I'm also on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. A bit of a very just background. I think I can see a few familiar names here, so I'll try and keep the background short, look at some of the updates that we've got to snapshots and trends and analysis, which is pretty interesting. A bit of snapshot in action and what's next, and I've specifically focused what's next on some of the target stuff to try and align with the presentation from Sandy and Hannah, and we are furiously working behind the scenes to try and make sure that we can be as aligned as possible. So look, really basically about 5 or 6 years ago, Ironbark was developing emissions citywide inventories or profiles for councils, just on a as needs basis for councils. Beyond Zero Emissions, who are an amazing independent solutions-focused think tank, we're doing the same thing for community groups and even training community groups up to develop profiles and understand how the GPC protocol works. And so we just got together and essentially thought, the worst thing that can happen is that councils or even community groups are spending their time and effort trying to learn the 250,000 pages of GPC protocol to develop a profile. We haven't got the data there. And so we teamed up, we got some money from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation and put it all online. So it's free and publicly available for everyone, all 537 councils in Australia. You can go up there and check it out. It's got nationally consistent data in accordance with the global protocol, and the best available data sourced. We see iterations or improvements with every iteration. We'll go through some of those improvements now. I guess our overall sort of ethos is that we believe that the data should be open and available to all. You know, none of us are really doing our jobs. Certainly Ironbark aren't if there are councils who are spending years trying to, you know, develop just that initial start, that baseline, that inventory when the information is there. And so we want to make sure that having a lack of data isn't the reason that we're seeing climate action happen. So open data all the way, provide it free whenever we can. And also with every iteration, we lift everyone. So we don't just focus on working with one council that can afford it. We lift the data for one council, we lift it for 537 around Australia. Over the last few years, there's a lot of other organisations that have jumped on board to help fund it, or groups of councils like in South Australia to get all of the SA online, and a bunch of independent technical reviewers and endorsers. I don't know if anyone hasn't gone through and checked our data over the last 3 or 4 years. We've also recently had some sponsors from councils, and so we really appreciate and love Darwin, Stonington, Manningham, Unley and Gawler chucking in who can bit of money and can then say that for their community groups that they're providing this information for them. Darwin actually put it in to provide it for on behalf of all 17 local governments in the Northern Territory. And most recently, the Victorian government provided support and funding to update so they could improve data accuracy, depict time series, and make it a little bit more user-friendly. And so these are the big changes that we've just seen in the last month or so. And we were lucky to have the still Minister for the Environment and Climate Change in Victoria, Lily D'Ambrosio, introduce and launch these changes a couple of weeks ago. So the first thing is we've got an extra year. There's always a bit of a data lag. So we've got 2020 and 2021 data that's available now. Sorry, 2020 and 2021 calendar year, should I say. The Australian Energy Statistics, AES, have updated some of their data sets, and so we've incorporated that. And so there's some minor changes for all 537 snapshots, even looking back, so historical figures. But when we get the info from the AES, and of course we get the emissions coefficients, which are always a little bit delayed, that's when we can make these big updates. Just losing track a little bit here, excuse me. We've got all profiles or inventories which are Basic Plus, which is pretty amazing. So Basic Plus essentially means, amongst other things, that it includes ag, forestry and land use, and also industrial processes and product use. And this was the big one. And so on your snapshot, and everyone can go and see their own snapshot anytime, you'll see that there's this new wedge, which means also that they will increase a little bit depending on the council area. But we've now got a complete Basic Plus profile for every council in Australia, which is, my understanding, is unique for anywhere in the world. We've also incorporated time series now, so you can just jump in and see how you are tracking. I'll get into some of the trends in a second. And also sectoral breakdowns. And so you click on, say, for example, the electricity subsector, and it will break it down into even more detailed information. So getting to that granular level. You can also look at that granular level for each subsector in a time series. And so this is Bega Valley just for electricity emissions, and each of res, commercial and industrial over time. 3 years there, it's going to be really interesting over time when you start to see it over 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And it's the same for the other subsectors. So transport. One thing I'll note here is that you'll see for Bega Valley, which is a smaller council, we've got on-road and aviation. For about 150 odd councils, we've actually got data that's been sourced from Google's Environmental Explorer, which means it's a lot more detailed. So we've got on-road freight subsector data for an additional group of councils. Generally, the criteria there is a population over 25,000, and we can include it. And we've been working in partnership with Google for the last couple of years to do that. And again, you can look at the time series for each subsector. Something happened in 2020 that changed things a lot. I think we all know what that might be. Same for ag, gas, waste, IPPU, the new one that's there. So for each of the subsectors now, you can jump in and have a look at that more granular level and also see where the trends are. This does mean that there are a couple of councils where the profiles have changed considerably when you add a new sector. So IPPU, industrial products use, and ag, forestry and land use weren't required to be included for a basic inventory, but for basic plus they are. And so what it means is for a couple of areas, you see this massive increase. Wollongong, that's essentially blue scope steel, Port Kembla, I'd imagine, and probably also have a bit of industrial use as well. And Gladstone too, a lot of the industrial processes there. You can see that that made some pretty big changes, but it's a more accurate profile for the emissions within that municipal boundary. You can also jump in and download under a different various sources now. Various, what do you call those things? PDFs or CSVs, file formats, that's probably the word I meant. And also there's some nice little social media things as well. So it's kind of been built on council data and for councils. And so for those that don't know Ironbark well, all we do is work with councils around Australia to help them reduce emissions, whether it's their operational corporate emissions or in the community. But Snapshot is also designed to keep an eye on broader community engagement. And it's interesting that a lot of community groups are the ones that will use it to advocate to the council or to federal government or the state or whoever it might be. And so it's been a great kind of discipline for us working with Beyond Zero Emissions to make sure that we've got something that's available for all, and we actually get to learn as well from the broader climate movement and advocacy organisations. A lot of because with municipal wide inventories or profiles, you're dealing with such large data sets, and often you've got scaled down data to the municipal level. That's changing though. It's often hard to try and actually see changes within a council's profile based on an actual event, whether it's something that a council has done or some other sort of intervention. Most of the time, the changes are due to sort of global things like state-based changes from moving from coal, decarbonising the grid, which means that the emission factors change, and so everyone's profile kind of goes down a little bit. But we've been able to see some changes just over the last couple of years because of COVID. And that shows through in the data. And you can also see the different areas, inner west in Sydney, Maribyrnong in Melbourne, compared to the whole of Western Australia, who of course didn't lock down as much of the other states. This is one of the first times that you can actually start to see some sort of intervention. It wasn't planned, obviously, but how it affects local or state emissions profiles. We saw massive changes overall in transport activity. So this is just some data that our data nerds internally jumped on and developed, looking at the change in transport since the start of COVID. Obviously, the public transport was a big one that suffered. And we also saw a lot of reductions, especially in those two big states where there was more locking down, and especially in Vic, with especially commercial and industrial energy. If you jump into Snapshot as well as the municipal profiles, you can also look at state by state. And so this is another interesting one where you can see the different comparisons over the last couple of years on a state by state level and try and understand how and why. You've got the two states that are decarbonising the most, Tassie and South Australia. We can see some massive trends there, and the start of changes, especially in New South Wales and Victoria, which have implemented some pretty progressive policies, both state governments over the last couple of years, and you can start to see the changes there as well. Queensland, WA and NT needing to lift their game a little bit. I'll talk, sorry, Steve and Dustin, I'm not sure, I've got some questions here. Maybe I'll take those to the end. If there are any burning questions that come up, given it's a small group, even just unmute yourself. But Amy, yes, there's no charge, to obtain that data. And at the end, I'll also show some docos that you can download that show some changes to where, what the changes are exactly, and also where we've been able to source what's called tier 2 real data as opposed to model data that's kind of scaled down to the municipal level. But there's absolutely no charge for any of this. Everything that's on Snapshot is free. it's really interesting to see how it's being used. So not just councils, but we hear, this is an organisation that we heard about from Joondalup in Western Australia, where it's been put to really good use. And we were thrilled to hear there's this Millennium Kids team and this Agents of Change organisation. This young guy, Siddharth, basically got on and got the snapshot profile and started to use it to look at actions to reduce emissions. I'm sure those sort of lists are pretty, most of us will have seen before, but these guys even have some local TV show or some YouTube channel where they start talking about it and using the profile to talk about, you know, where exactly we need to start putting our time and effort. I think this is one of the areas that we'll see an improvement down the track, where at the moment, you know, it's a point in time, we're not looking at forecasting information yet. And so while it's really valuable because community groups and councils can get an understanding about where their emissions are and perhaps step back and go, oh, probably didn't need to focus so much on waste. It's pretty small. We need to move to, you know, electricity, stationary energy. Probably more important than some of the data we're trying to think about how we get it out is looking at forecasts. So more importantly, what's happening in 2030, because we're going to see transport emissions inventories of every council in Australia increasing as the grid decarbonises and less of an impact or less sort of extra additional climate action in that electricity or stationary energy sector, especially electricity, because it's decarbonising as it is. Organisations, so this is Geelong, a sustainability group that basically use this to try and highlight and try and stop the big Viva energy portal down in Geelong, which would, I don't know, double or triple their whole municipal profile. We've also been getting a bunch of New South Wales councils. We know that I think Ballina and a few others have been using it for years in climate change reporting, presentations and IPNR reporting, which is a specific New South Wales reporting requirements, and also to raise internally. But we've also got these sort of groups. We had no idea about these guys. Community Voice for Hume in New South Wales that had started to use it and even develop their own like emissions positive snapshot profiles and wheels. And I've put the website there if anyone wants to have a look, but we kind of want it to be as much of an open source tool as possible. So we love this kind of stuff, even though we had no idea. And of course, it's been used a lot because we've got federal electorates there. So some interesting elections or electorates from 2019, Kooyong, Indi and Higgins, where we had some big changes in 2022. And Hume, where we're going to have a big change maybe in 2025 with the greatest of energy ministers, Angus Taylor, potentially not making it back one more time around. Next, the info and the data will keep improving. And so this means that sometimes that you're going to get an emissions inventory or profile that even your previous years might change. Like if we were to say, and this was a question that we asked at a webinar a few years ago, like if we are able to somehow get DNSP data, so distribution business, let's just say the utilities finally say, look, have everything. Here's all our information, all the data, it's all open source, it's free. And we could, and others, organisations could put it into the tools and update it and check for accuracy, but it means there's going to be changes for everyone. And generally what we've been told is, yes, please change it. And so what we've been doing in the last, this last iteration is incorporating some of these changes. It's a horrible screen, apologies, but this is kind of a bit of summary of some of the changes that we've had just over the last year or so, as we've included tier 2 or electricity and gas data for Queensland and some of New South Wales. And so we've now got that accurate real data, and we're lobbying very hard in Victoria for the same thing.
Excuse me, you will need to wrap up in a second, mate.
Okay, no dramas. You can download all of this, and Steve or Dustin, I'm happy to just email this through if need be, but those changes, and for the question that came before, we can pass it all on. And I think one of the other key things is reporting, one of the big changes over the last couple of years. And so councils would like to report if they could do it really quickly. And we've been working with our friends at CDP to make sure that there's an ability to just automatically have a snapshot profile signed, sealed and delivered, and I guess approved for use within reporting. And so that's now something that you can do. We'll be working again more with Sandy and Hannah in the next couple of months to try and even look at an API, which is whiz-bang web term, which means that you could actually just press a button. There are still a few steps, but that'll make it easier. Finally, Steve, I'll just quickly touch on science-based targets, because this is an area that we will be working again, and we have been talking to the crew here. We're trying to find out whether this is the sort of thing that sits within a snapshot or maybe a snapshot adjacent thing. We're not really sure yet. It might be something else that's instead a different sort of product. But if anyone's out there that's interested and wants information based on Australian methodologies that we are trying to get automatically verified, so you don't have to go through the process every different organisation, jump online to that website, and there's also a doco that you can download as well. And I'll chuck it into the chat in a second. It'll basically tell you how it works here, and also you can get a free science-based target and carbon budget for your municipality by just jumping onto that website and clicking on contact. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Lex. Tons of information. That tool just looks so interesting to kind of dig into those second tier level. I could spend a lot of time on that one. So yeah, it looks like I think you already answered Amy's question about the charges. Were there any other questions for Lex? Just feel free to unmute yourselves, and yeah, go ahead, Mitch.
Not really a question. Alexi kind of answered it right at the end there. I was just hoping to reiterate the importance, while I've got Sandy and Hannah and Alexi all in a room together, how easy it will be for us if that collaboration happens, where the report we get from Ironbark translate into the questions that CDP ask, in terms of what's included elsewhere and what's not occurring in inventories and that sort of thing, as well as the validation of the science-based targets. That is something we've been hanging out for.
Yeah, loud and clear, Mitch, and us too. I'd just make the point, which I think we'll get there with some of those things, and like all the other things that I mentioned earlier, and the funding that comes through for these sort of improvements, as you can imagine, like we can get, the funding is quite easy for some things, but if you try and get philanthropic or state or federal funding for reporting emissions, it's not overly sexy, so it's really quite hard. So there's a small cost recovery at the moment, just if you get that CSV that you can automatically update, but we're definitely trying to find ways to just make it easier, because it's just, yeah, it's crazy to be having to do it on, each council basis.
Yeah, copy that. Appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that question, Mitch. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I guess I can start going into the energy access and poverty pillar. So let me just share. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, you guys know, my name is Dustin. I'm the Programs and Communications Officer for ICLEI, but I also provide support for the GCoM help desk role for the Oceania region. So I'm just going to be kind of walking through the new energy access and poverty pillar that GCoM's going to be introducing in 2023. Yeah, so the Global Covenant of Mayors, they introduced the energy access and poverty pillar, or the EAPP, of the Common Reporting Framework. And it's just meant to support signatories to take action towards like a more just energy transition. So the new pillar, which was recently introduced at COP27 at the LGMA Pavilion, it's been kind of forming over 2 years, and in consultation with 13 regional and national governments, and has involved 47 partners as well. So in January, they're going to officially launch January 2023, so this next month. And so now signatories can then start taking steps to earn the badges along the path. So this third pillar essentially follows the same path as the other two pillars as part of the CRF process. And these are the areas where signatories can earn badges. So the first part is crafting the assessment, setting the targets, creating an action plan, and then of course reporting on all these steps. The EAPP is designed to cover 3 energy attributes, and this is in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which essentially states to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So these are the 3 attributes here, but they also cover indicators. So each of these attributes will then have indicators, and some of them are mandatory, some of them are non-mandatory. The examples that we're using here, they're yet to be confirmed, and they should be providing a guidance note in the beginning of the year for that. So, for example, one of the energy attributes that in your assessment you might look at is how much of the installed capacity of renewable energy is within your local district. So the next step along that line is setting the energy action targets. And so these, they mirror and sort of go over the 3 attributes. And for example, you might have a target in that attribute to improve energy access to sustainable energy, to increase your installed capacity for renewable energy. So next would be to complete the action plan. And this action plan for the 3rd pillar would obviously include energy access or poverty elements. Let's see if I can, yep, and some of those here, let me just move this here, would be to identify your priority sectors in an industry where you can meet those targets, identify some synergies and trade-offs and co-benefits of implementing an energy access target, and then creating a financial strategy. So again, these are just examples. That are going to be confirmed later. So finally, it's just to report on all of these steps here. So just to kind of give an overview on some of the time commitments for reporting. So if you are already committed to GCoM, this to report for the access assessment, and for to set targets, you would have to report within 2 years of the pillar being activated. So if you're already a signatory, already signed up, you'd have 2 years to report on these 2. If you have yet to report, or I'm sorry, have yet to sign up as a GCoM signatory, then you would have 2 years from when you sign. So, and then within 3 years, the action plan is due, and that's so that's again too, if you're already a signatory, you would have 3 years from the activation of this pillar. So yep, and pretty short, that was it for that one. So again, just as a disclaimer, the examples that we used there were just examples, but there's going to be a guidance document that's going to be coming out presumably in January. And so that'll give some more details about some of the mandatory indicators that you have to report on, and then also some of the voluntary. So if your council wants to be a little bit more ambitious, you can include some of those voluntary ones. And so that's it for me. I guess if we had any questions on that, I might just hand over back to Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. And look, we're right on the hour, so we're happy to stay on for a little longer for answering questions. But thanks for that overview. We don't have a lot of detail yet because, like Dustin said, there'll be a guidance note come out early next year, and then there's a grace period, just as there always has been, for councils to start picking up this 3rd pillar. but it's quite timely in a way. I think given that our region covers both Pacific Islands, New Zealand, Australia, I was talking to our partners, actually to Solomon Power in the Solomon Islands last Friday. When you talk about just access to energy, only 15% of their households outside of the main city have electricity, in this day and age. And in the city, something like 50-something% of premises are connected to the grid. So they've got a long way to go just on basic access. But of course, all you've got to do now is read the papers, look at the media here, and for us, it's affordability, not access. So, and the transition to renewable energy. So I think this will be a real enhancement to the global covenant of mayors. But look, that's it for us today. Let's just see if there are any other specific questions. But I think everyone on the call today have good contact with CDP, with ICLEI, with Ironbark anyway, so you can obviously follow up for yourselves. So I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you very much, Hannah and Sandy and Lex and Dustin. And it was good to see you all. This is probably almost the last you'll hear from us for 2022. So see you all in 2023 and have a great break. Thank you.